Hello, and thank you for joining our third annual Day with DISA. Before the session gets started, let's go over a few things. A copy of the presentation will be available to download once the session has ended under the Materials section. If you have questions about the information in this session, enter them in the Q&A section below, and the speaker will answer them once the session has ended. If we don't get to your question, we'll reach out to you at the end of the conference. If you have questions about the topics or trends that are mentioned throughout Day with DISA and how they pertain to your company, and you'd like to reach out to one of our team members directly, hit the chat icon at the bottom of daywithdisa.com and you'll be connected directly with one of our team members. Thank you for attending live. Each of our live attendees is eligible for our prize drawing at the end of the conference. And each session that you attend live increases your chances of winning either a Nintendo bundle or a brand new iPhone 12. Finally, I'd like to take this time to thank all of our sponsors for their participation in Day with DISA. Specifically, I'd like to call out CRL, our title sponsor for 3 years running. We'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, OraSure, Quest Diagnostics, Samba Safety, and Psychomedics. All of our sponsors' support is greatly appreciated. With that, let's get started. Enjoy your session.
Hi, and thank you so much for joining us for this session of Day with DISA. Today we'll be talking about how you can build a culture of safety at your company. Our speaker today is Brady Quarles. He's been with DISA for over 14 years, and he's currently the Associate Vice President over Energy Sales. Brady, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, Thomas. I would like to thank everyone for participating in DISA's Day with DISA event this week. You know, in this post-COVID-19 environment that we find ourselves in, it's important for organizations to have a strong and robust drug and alcohol program that meets the needs of the company and the environment that the company works in.
Great. Well, hey, Brady, let's do a little bit of housekeeping and then we'll dive straight into the presentation. If you're watching this presentation and you have a question that comes up, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom right. Just go ahead and click on that button. Submit your question. At the end of the presentation, we'll answer as many as we can in the time that we have left. If we're unable to get to your question, we'll reach out to you after Day with DISA and touch base. Additionally, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, we'll make that available in the materials section at the bottom right after the presentation. So as Brady's wrapping up, we'll have that link show up there and you can download a copy of the PDF. Without further ado, Brady, take it away.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move to the first slide. So to get started, why are we here? How big of a problem is drug abuse? And within the next few slides, we want to definitely, and hopefully that I will answer that question for you guys. Consequences of drug use in workplace. As most people know, actions always have consequences. When it comes to drug and alcohol use on the job, the consequences can be costly to a company. In addition to monetary losses, people can get hurt or even lose their lives if organizations aren't mitigating risk and working to keep illicit drug and alcohol users out of the workforce. As an organization, you're going to want to know what the consequences of drug use in the workplace are and how these actions can affect your company. So what are a few consequences? So, poor work performance is a big issue. What does poor work performance look like? We have inconsistent quality of work. We have employees with lack of focus, poor decision-making. How about increased absenteeism? Individuals that abuse substances are more inclined to call in sick from hangovers or other ailments specific to substance abuse. We have increased turnover. Substance abusers will have performance challenges and companies will need to move on from these individuals in most cases. How about other monetary consequences for your organization? We talked about increased turnover. With increased turnover, you also have to talk about the increased time and money it will take to train and onboard their replacements as well. Theft. Illicit drug users will often resort to stealing in order to support a habit. Substance abuse can make decent people make poor decisions, so always be mindful of the fact and continue to drug test people after they're hired. Lastly, accidents. Accidents can lead to loss of life and or equipment. Any actions that impact a person's judgment, alertness, perception, motor coordination, or even emotional state should be mitigated. The cost of drugs in the workplace. With this slide, we wanted to show the group that what illicit drug and alcohol use costs companies on a national level. Additionally, we'll answer the question about if drug and alcohol abuse is a factor in work-related fatalities. I'll give you a hint, yes. So how about costs? US companies lose $100 billion annually on drug and alcohol related abuse. If 17% of the workforce is considered substance abusers, each abuser costs their companies about $7,000 a year. As a number of the people on this webinar probably already know, the company that I work for caters to safety-sensitive organizations. DISA believes that illicit drug users in a safety-sensitive setting will cost their companies even more. We think that annual costs per year is probably more like $35,000 annually for safety-sensitive users. So that's a 400% increase from the normal non-safety sensitive workplace estimation. Lastly, can substance abuse increase fatalities in the workplace? The answer is yes. 40% of all industrial workplace fatalities are caused by substance abusers. In addition, 10 to 20% of all fatalities in the workplace results in a positive drug and alcohol test. Next slide, and this is going to be a new section. What we're looking at is drug testing challenges. We got marijuana, opioids, CBD oil, fentanyl, and COVID-19. Next slide. Marijuana facts and figures. From 2014 to 2018, marijuana use is up 16%. In states that have legalized marijuana, the rates are even higher. Let's take a look at Colorado. Positivity rates in this state have increased 20%. Washington state has increased 23%. In order to start our discussion on marijuana, I want to reiterate that the challenge of managing a drug-free workforce will become more difficult with the further legalization of marijuana. Alcohol is legal, but the substance still has its effects on the workforce. Marijuana is the same. Make sure that marijuana use and being under the influence of the substance is prohibited in your policy. Why should you prohibit marijuana? Like alcohol, it has a number of side effects. The effects consist of disorientation, confusion, attention deficits, euphoria, dysphoria, impaired memory, and even blurred vision. All the side effects that we've just mentioned could lead to major issues in a work environment, especially in a safety-sensitive environment. Marijuana public opinion. In the next few slides, I wanted to make a point to you that individuals' thoughts and beliefs about specific drugs are evolving. The evolution of these thoughts and beliefs can make your job managing your drug-free program more challenging as well. In 1969, only 12% of all adults supported the legalization of marijuana. Since then, support for legalization has increased, and in 2019, most Americans supported legalization. That's 66% of us. Wow. Let's take a look at the graph. In the horizontal axis, we have age groups. In the vertical axis, we have the percentage of people that support legalization of marijuana. So for a few takeaways here, obviously the younger you are, the more likely you are to support legalization. Surprise, surprise. Lastly, just looking at the steady climb from 1969 to 2019, the percentage of Americans that support legalization have increased by 54% in the last 50 years. That's huge. Who knows what these numbers are going to look like in the future? Make sure that your company is prepared for the changes that are coming. Marijuana is on the ballot. Looking at the map, a state that deems marijuana fully illegal is represented by the color white. The green colored states represent states with some form of marijuana legalization. Going back 3 or 4 years ago, most of this map would be white, representing the fact that marijuana was fully legal in most states. Now the entire West Coast is legalized and the East Coast isn't that far behind. In addition, almost all states minus a few have some form of marijuana acceptance. With that being said, What will the United States map look like in the future? More and more states are moving to legalize marijuana in some forms. In the near future, other states are expected to vote on legalizing cannabis for adults over 21. The shift is heading towards acceptance throughout the US. CBD oil, a consistently baffling conversation. To start out, what is CBD oil? CBD oil is a product that's derived from cannabis. It's a type of cannabinoid, which are the chemicals naturally found in marijuana plants. Even though it comes from marijuana plants, CBD doesn't create a high effect or any form of intoxication. Intoxication is caused by another cannabinoid known as THC. A number of perceived health benefits of CBD include anxiety relief, pain control, sleep aid, treatment of depression, and even acne control. I didn't know that one. Looking at the title of the slide, why is CBD such a tricky issue for organizations trying to promote a drug-free workforce? To start, CBD can be made from marijuana or hemp. CBD made from hemp is legal because it's characterized by containing 0.3% or less of THC. CBD oil made from marijuana will contain greater than 0.3% of THC, and this can lead to positive drug tests. So, what are some challenges with CBD? First and foremost, I would say lack of oversight. The CBD industry is unregulated. The FDA does not regulate or test the THC levels in CBD oil. Since there is no regulation over the products, an individual will not always know if they're taking a type of CBD that could lead to a positive drug test. How about state statutes? Like marijuana, the legality of CBD oil varies state by state. Lastly, CBD oil has a potential impact on your organization's drug policy as well. Historically, corporate drug policies assume that any THC detected is from the ingestion of marijuana. CBD introduces a new consideration. Now companies will have situations to where a positive result for THC could either result from the ingestion of marijuana or even CBD oil. To conclude on the topic of CBD oil, I would say it's important to know that the number of CBD related products available in the market are increasing on a daily basis. The products pose a challenge because marijuana has historically been the only source for THC. Now, many CBD oils contain small amounts of THC and can lead to a positive drug test. In addition, consuming high doses of CBD oil can result in a positive drug test as well. Both circumstances aren't good for the individual that is taking the CBD for its perceived health benefits, and it's going to make your job managing a drug and alcohol program a lot harder. It's not just marijuana. Earlier in the webinar, we spoke about the consequences of drug and alcohol abuse and how the further legalization of marijuana will make managing your program more challenging. Unfortunately, there are other drugs besides marijuana that will make your job more difficult. Opioids are another issue. So everyone knows an opioid is a legal pharmaceutical that is used primarily for pain relief. The substance is also used in anesthesia as well. On a national level, over 2 million people are estimated to have a problem with opioids. Painkillers are a growing problem in our nation. 33% of Americans used painkillers in 2017. Out of those Americans, about 12% of them didn't have a prescription. As a reminder, drug abuse also costs citizens money, not just companies. Addressing the impact of substance abuse alone is estimated to cost Americans more than $740 billion each year. Next slide. Prescription drug abuse is a national problem. In order to provide you a visual of how concerning the opioid epidemic is, we have another US map to review that will shine a light on the opioid abuse in 2017. Before I start, I want to let the group know that I was very surprised by the information provided in the slide. It was very alarming to say the least. So moving forward, as we see the legend, we're focusing on number of opioid prescriptions per 100 people by state. So we're tracking states that average less than 64 prescriptions per 100 people, states that are between 64 to 82 prescriptions per 100 people. States that are between 83 and 107 prescriptions per 100 people. And finally, states that had more than 107 prescriptions per 100 people. So looking at the map, my initial expectations were that most states, if not all, would fall below 64 prescriptions. This was not the case. What do we learn from looking at the map? It's apparent that certain areas like the Southeast and the Northwest regions of the United States are having major issues with opioids. We have 7 states on a national level that have more than 83 opioid prescriptions per every 100 people. All of those states right now are in the Southeast. So how about Alabama? For every 100 citizens, there are 107 prescriptions out there. How does this happen? I'll assume that individuals are obtaining multiple prescriptions from multiple sources. Only thing I can say here is be better, Alabama. Percentage of employers impacted by opioid-abusing employees. Looking at this slide, it's a little bit of an eye chart, but the gist of the slide is that most organizations are affected by opioid use. Individuals that abuse opioids are in the workforce, and their drug issues impact employers and your employees as well. Just to highlight a few impacts from the 2017 National Safety Council, what do we have here? So 32% of organizations have seen positive opioid drug tests from their employees. 39% of organizations have reported increased absenteeism or missed work due to opioid use. Once again, individuals that abuse substances are more inclined to call in sick from hangovers and are ailments specific to substance abuse. I'd say absenteeism leads to loss of productivity, and that's a fact. 15% of organizations have stated that they've had on-the-job accidents that have contributed to injury or near misses. Accidents can lead to loss of life and or equipment. Any actions that impact a person's judgment, alertness, perception, motor coordination, and emotional state should be mitigated. Lastly, 10% of the organizations polled in 2017 stated that they've been affected by employees overdosing. Losing employees to non-accident related events on or off the job is not an issue that your company wants to deal with. Organizational morale will be a big issue, along with the added productivity and monetary consequences that come along with these types of events. Next slide. Understanding fentanyl. To start, what is fentanyl? Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is 50 to 100 times stronger than other opioids like morphine and heroin. Pharmaceutical fentanyl was initially developed for pain management treatment of cancer patients. Because of its powerful opioid properties, fentanyl is also diverted for abuse as well. For example, fentanyl is added to heroin to increase its potency or be disguised as highly potent heroin. Many users believe that they are purchasing heroin and actually don't know that they are actually purchasing fentanyl, which often results in overdose deaths. Pretty scary stuff. You could say that fentanyl has made purchasing certain types of drugs like playing Russian roulette. The drug users don't know exactly what they're getting. We mentioned that fentanyl accounts for a large number of opioid overdose deaths in the United States. In fact, nearly 70% of the 67,000 opioid overdose deaths in 2018 were due to fentanyl. So let's take a moment and look back at this graph to the upper right-hand corner. The graph is illustrating the 3 waves in the rise of the opioid deaths from 1999 to 2018. So let's look at wave number 1. Wave number 1 shows deaths due to abuse of normal prescription opioid use. Wave number 1 starts at about 1 death per 100,000 people in 1999, and within 19 years, it grows to about 4 deaths per 100,000 people. Wave number 2 depicts deaths due to the abuse of heroin in a 19-year time frame. Based off of the graph, you'll see that 1999 through 2010, nothing much is happening. In 2010, we see a spike to where the deaths per 100,000 people jumps from about 0.5 people per year to over 4 deaths per 100,000 people by 2018. Lastly, wave number 3 shows deaths due to abuse of synthetic opioids like fentanyl and tramadol. Deaths for these synthetic opioids are less than 1 per 100,000 people from 1999 to 2013. And then we see a spike. Starting in 2013, deaths increased dramatically. And by 2018, we're looking right at 10 deaths per 100,000 people. Wow. You know, it's safe to say that fentanyl is by far one of the most dangerous and lethal drugs out there on the market today. I'd say stay away from drugs in general because you never know what you're buying these days. And substances like fentanyl could be purchased, by a user when they don't even know it. Next slide. Opioid epidemic has led to a rise in amphetamine use. In 2018, the national media and our politicians started to point out the effects that opioids were having on this society. With the spotlight now on the opioid epidemic, drug abusers' behaviors, have changed somewhat. Doctors have started to become more cautious on their prescription habits. Access to opioids have become much harder to obtain for the user. What did drug abusers do? Abusers didn't just stop using. They looked for other drugs like amphetamines to satisfy their habits. So what are amphetamines? An amphetamine is a legal pharmaceutical primarily used to treat health problems such as obesity, narcolepsy, and ADHD. That's attention deficit hyperactivity. Since 2018, amphetamines have resulted in more positive drug tests than cocaine and opioids. For a quick review of the graph that focuses on the percentage of DISA positivity rates for the years of 2017 through 2019, we see that certain drug positivity rates are on the rise and others are decreasing. For instance, cocaine positives are decreasing. More than likely, illicit drug users are moving to other drugs that are easier to attain, like pharmaceutical drugs. Example, opioids and amphetamines. Also, let's look at opioids. At its peak in 2018, opioids accounted for 17% of all of DISA's positivity drug tests. By 2019, opioid positives had dropped to 14%. Why? Once again, doctors became more cautious on their prescription practices due to the spotlight that has come from media and politicians. These opioid abusers in 2018 more than likely shifted their drug abuse to other easily attained pharmaceuticals like amphetamines. In fact, the graph supports the notion. After 2017, we see a sharp rise in the percentage of positives at DISA. Amphetamines accounted for 20% of all of DISA's positives in 2018 and 2019. That's a huge number. Next slide. Trend leading up to COVID. In the previous slides, we talked about the consequences of drug and alcohol use and how new types of drugs are contributing to increased drug use in America. Before COVID, we saw that the percentage of individuals using drugs was much higher in 2017 and 2018 than there were in 2015 and 2016. A steady rise in drug and alcohol use on a yearly basis is the new normal. In fact, 53.2 million Americans over the age of 12 have admitted to being past drug users. That's 19.4% of our population. Another way to look at this fact is 1 out of every 5 individuals that that are over the age of 12 used illicit drugs in the past. Very alarming to say the least. What happens in times of crisis? It's a fact that people in times of crisis tend to rely on self-medicating to help them cope with their increased anxiety, stress, depression, and fear of the unknown potentially. It's more important now, more than ever before, for employers to continue to drug test and further protect their company and their employees. Lastly, prior to COVID-19 pandemic, substance abuse rates were on the rise due to the combination of the legalization of marijuana and opioid epidemic. With the pandemic adding emotional distress, the numbers are expected to continue to rise, even after the coronavirus comes to an end. What do these escalations look like? COVID-19 has accelerated amphetamine and opioid use. In a previous slide, we talked about how opioid use was decreasing and amphetamine use was increasing in 2019. What about looking into what happens when you introduce a global pandemic into the mix of the changing landscapes pertaining to drug and alcohol use in America. Looking at the chart, we'll focus on DISA's year-over-year number of positive random drug tests between the peak COVID timeframes of April through September of 2020. We'll compare those positivity rates to the 2019 positivity rates for the same timeframe. So starting on the left-hand side, so what are we looking at? Marijuana, it's up 12%. Cocaine, so when we look at 2019 versus 2020, it is actually down 36%. Next, opioids, up 432%. Once again, this is from 2019 to 2020. And what we're looking at the dates from April through September. And lastly, we have amphetamines. Amphetamines is up 226%. That's huge. And it's not slowing down. What we're looking at on this slide is year-over-year positivity rates for opioid and amphetamines during random testing during peak COVID months. Once again, the graph focuses on the peak COVID months of April through September for years 2019 and 2020. As a reminder, 2019 was a year without crisis to where 2020 has been plagued by a global pandemic. What happens to random positivity rates for pharmaceuticals that are easily obtained in our post-pandemic environment? Let's look again. So looking at the far left, we'll take opioids, for example. We'll start in April. Now, when we compare 2019 results from 2020, we're looking at 405%. May, 437%. In June and July, you'll see that we have a peak here. So we're starting to peak. So June goes to 605%. And in July, we got 573%. That's huge. We do start to see somewhat of a decrease here when we go down in August to 417%. But that is still a huge number. Let's take amphetamines. In April, we see kind of the same thing. In April and May, we were somewhere in the range of 240% for both months. Then we see peaks in June, 277% and 299% in July. And then lastly, we've got August and September where we're starting to see a decline. Highlight September, we're going down 138%. Let's keep in mind, that's a big decrease from August, but what we're looking at here is still a huge increase. I guess the last point that I'll make about this slide is that we see peak positivity increases in the months of June and July for opioid and amphetamines. It's not a coincidence that those months also represent months where depression might be setting in for people that don't know what the future holds. In times of uncertainty, once again, people gravitate to drug and alcohol use. Understanding your options. What can you test for and when? Next slide. Drug testing methodologies. There are different methods used for drug testing. These methods differ in terms of costs, accuracy, intrusiveness, and where they can be administered. Each test looks for chemical metabolites or traces that the drug leaves behind after it has eliminated from your body. The three main drug testing methods that DISA and other third-party administrators specialize in are urinalysis, hair, and oral fluid testing. Methodologies differ in many ways, but all types of testing have common denominators in what they are testing for. As an organization, you want to have a clear view of what kind of substances that you are screening. When looking at drug testing policies, you'll notice that the tested substances are usually classified as panels. The term panel refers to a drug or family of drugs included in a drug test. For example, the panel of opioids includes morphine, codeine, and heroin. The more panels a test includes, the greater the scope of that test. Panels can also include added substances known as markers into the testing. As an example, semi-synthetic opioids such as oxycodone, oxymorphone, hydrocodone, and hydromorphone have been included in the opioid testing family or testing in most current panels today. So with that being said, let's kind of take a look at the screenshot once again. So what drugs get tested for? On the far left, in 1989, the Department of Transportation actually created federal guidelines based off of certain job functions. These job functions consisted of things like, hey, are you a CDL driver? Are you driving a vehicle that's greater than 26,001 pounds? And so what they came up with was a 5-panel drug test. The 5-panel drug test included marijuana, cocaine, opioids, amphetamines, and PCP. When you look at opioids in the far left, it also says included synthetic opioids. In 1989, there was no such thing, and so they didn't include those. And synthetic opioids were actually included onto the DOT policy in 2015. So what if your organization doesn't have individuals that fall under these federal guidelines? So you have the ability as an organization to create your own program, your own policy. So if that's the case, I would look to the right. We have 10 panels. So a 10 panel, once again, you are testing for more types of drugs. When you look at a basic normal 10 panel at this date, that's going to include marijuana, cocaine, opioids, amphetamines, and PCP. So everything that's included in the DOT requirements, but they're also going to include barbiturates, benzodiazepine, propoxyphene, methadone, and even methaqualone. So basically, they're adding pharmaceutical drugs to the mix. Next slide. Most common drug methodologies. What we're looking at on this slide is detection windows for a few of the standard drug testing methodologies used in employee screening. So let's take a urine. Let's take a look at urine. Urine, 0 to 7 days detection window. Oral fluid. Your detection window is anywhere from 2 hours to a few days. How about blood testing? Blood testing is not normally used in normal testing situations due to its intrusiveness, but it can be used in post-accident situations. Blood testing provides immediate detection up to a few days. Next, we'll talk about hair testing, which provides a long-term detection window. The detection window for hair is a week to 90 days. To conclude this slide, all methodologies have their advantages and disadvantages. DISA recommends that clients use a combination of a short-term and a long-term methodology to create a robust drug and alcohol program that provides multiple barriers, to keep illicit drug users out of the organization. Historical testing data for the standard drug panels. So what we're looking at here on the far left, we have different types of panels that are tested for different number of panels, including their different methodologies as well. So top left-hand side, first we had a 5-panel urine test. Pre-employment positivity rates was about 1.72%, randoms right at 1%, and then the number one drug of choice is marijuana for this type of drug testing. So let's take a look at the 10-panel urine tests. And so we're testing for 5 additional drugs. So that pre-employment positivity rate goes to almost 3%, and the random still is going to stay about 1% as well. Once again, with urinalysis, the number one drug of choice is marijuana. Next, we go back to another 5-panel here. So look at this, pre-employment positivity rates for hair is 7.33%. That's huge. Random testing, once again, right about 1%. And then number one drug of choice, we have something new here, that's cocaine. And lastly, we've got oral fluid, and this is a 11-panel. Pre-employment, 1%. Random, 0.23%. And lastly, the number one drug of choice, is marijuana. So let's kind of talk about this a little bit and just maybe give you guys a few highlights on this. I guess what I would say is the increase of the positivity rate when you go from a 5 to a 10-panel urinalysis is high. Testing for more drugs almost always leads to higher positivity rates. If you decide to go with urine, DISA recommends the 10-panel if allowed. Once again, if your employees fall under DOT regulations, they will need to test under a DOT 5-panel. But these employees can also be included in other stringent non-DOT corporate policies within your organization. How about the pre-employment positivity rate for hair testing? Hair testing is a great methodology for the detection of drugs that metabolize quickly. One example of a drug that metabolizes quickly is cocaine. With hair testing, substances like cocaine, amphetamines, and opioids will have higher positivity rates with marijuana. Building an effective policy, what your program should look like. Next slide. Building your policy, determine drug testing needs. The first step of building a drug policy for an organization is to identify what methodology or methodologies are needed in order to meet your organization's desired result. Federal regulations might require you to test a certain way in some situations, but your drug program could consist of multiple policies within different methodologies used in different times. Once again, the most common methodologies in drug testing are urinalysis, hair testing, and oral fluid. DISA recommends using a combination of short-term and long-term detection methodologies in order to create barriers to keep illicit drug users out of your organization. So what does that look like? When we talk about short-term drug testing methodologies, I would say definitely you could use urine or oral. Urine as a methodology has been around the longest, and so I would recommend that. How about long-term detection? Long-term detection can be identified by using hair testing. Next, your organization will need to identify and determine what type of test purposes will be needed. To name a few, you have pre-employment. Pre-employment is when you screen applicants and future employees before they come on board. Offers almost always hinge on results of these tests. Using a long-term methodology like hair to detect habitual users is recommended for pre-employment. Random testing. Will you randomly test your employees? DISA does suggest that you randomly test all of your employees. Higher random percentages are always recommended for safety-sensitive job functions. Why randoms? In my mind, a random test is the biggest deterrent that a drug program can have. If John Doe knows that he won't be tested again after the pre-employment process, he basically has a green light to use drugs in the future, and that's not what an organization wants. Reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion testing, also known as for-cause drug testing, is performed when supervisors have evidence and or reasonable cause to suspect that an employee is on drugs. Evidence is based upon direct observations, either by the supervisor or they can even come from another employee as well. One last reason to test that I will talk about is post-accident testing. Post-accident drug testing is performed after an employee has been involved in a workplace accident. This type of testing is used to determine whether drugs were a factor in the incident. So to touch base on another best practice, make sure that your organization is sending all tests to a laboratory for analysis. Sending your specimens to a SAMHSA, FDA, and CAP certified laboratory will save you in the long run with any potential legal litigation. Also, specimens should always be sent to a medical review officer as well. A medical review officer, MRO, is a licensed physician responsible for reviewing lab test results from an employer's drug testing program. The MDR must have knowledge about pharmacology and toxicology of prescription and illicit drugs, as well as federal agency drug testing regulations and guidelines. The MRO's primary duty is to monitor and determine lab test results, including medical explanations for laboratory confirmed positives, adulterated, substituted, and invalid drug test results. Additionally, they must ensure the timelines and accuracy of drug test results to the employer while maintaining the utmost confidentiality. So, the MRO process creates a more fair opportunity for donors who are prescribed a medication that could result in a non-negative result to provide a valid prescription or legitimate explanation for the results. The MRO process prevents wrongful accusations and further protects both the employer and donor's rights in the scenario from potential litigation or, wrongful firing. Lastly, make sure that your policy includes information pertaining to process for fitness for duty and return to work is also a must. Legal language that defines safety-sensitive positions is always needed. Next slide. A clear written policy. As you will see, this slide is a little bit of an eye chart, so I won't speak to everything. Long story short, your drug policy needs to be clear and concise about what behaviors are prohibited. For example, alcohol and marijuana are legal in some instances, but you want to make sure that you prohibit the use of these substances at your place of work. Also, make it clear in the policy that employees shouldn't be under the influence of these substances while at work. Next, make sure that the parameters of the drug testing program are included in the policy. How is the company testing? What methodologies does your organization prefer? Just my opinion, but I recommend hair testing at pre-employment and an ongoing random program using a short-term detection methodology like urinalysis. When does your company test? What test reasons require testing in the policy? We talked about pre-employment, random testing, post-accident testing, etc. What drugs is your organization testing for? Example, marijuana, opioids, cocaine, amphetamines. Are you using a 5, 10, or 11 panel drug policy? One last time, DISA recommends that you test for as many drugs as possible, in your non-DOT program. Another question for your organization is, what are the consequences of policy violations for your organization? Will you allow rehab and let employees come back to work once they have completed return to duty testing? Or does your organization believe in zero tolerance? Zero tolerance essentially means that rehab is allowed and a positive drug test will lead to the termination of the employee. Lastly, an organization needs to determine if a medical disclosure policy is needed. Many people use legally prescribed drugs without failing a drug or violating company policy. And the DOT specifically states that the age of the prescription cannot be considered in the review of a positive drug test. A medical disclosure requires employees to self-identify to their employers that medications they might be on before they're out in the workforce. It is important to know that medical disclosure policies, it is important for safety sensitive positions. We don't want John Doe working on a crane when he's using a legal opioid on the work site for sure. Illegal and legal drugs could pose a threat to workplace safety. If you don't already have a medical disclosure policy in place, you may be opening yourself up to legal drug use on the job in your safety sensitive position, and that's not what you want. Next slide, employees' education and training. As an organization with a newly created policy, what's next? Once the policy has been created, it's important that your employees are educated on the specifics of the policy. In many cases, HR teams will perform policy reviews for their employees. Policy updates will also need to be had when changes are made to your current testing policy. Companies can also provide specific trainings that will provide educational material. So for employee training, I would recommend an employee awareness training for all employees. Employees, they need to know what substances and actions are prohibited while on the job. Most importantly, they need to know what are the consequences of violating the policy with positive tests or even refusal to test. For supervisors, a supervisor awareness training will be important. Giving your supervisors the knowledge of how to identify illicit drug and alcohol abuse is vital. Follow the signs. There are 3 different types of signs to look for. You have physical signs, that's bloodshot eyes, dilated pupils, slurred speech, unsteady walk, shakes or tremors, inability to sit still, sleeping at work or difficulty staying awake. How about behavioral signs? Attendance problems, tardiness, absences, excessive absenteeism. Those are a number of behavior signs. Lastly, psychological signs. You have unexplained changes in personality or attitude, sudden mood changes, angry outbursts or inappropriate laughing, inability to focus or concentrate. Educating the supervisor on program processes and procedures include documentation requirements are a must. For example, document all signs and symptoms leading up to and during a reasonable suspicion drug test. If an employee is sent off-site for a reasonable suspicion drug test, do not allow them to drive themselves, especially in a company car. This increases your liability because you already believe they may be under the influence. Lastly, it's always a good idea to have your employees sign off on the policy for verification that they have reviewed and they understand the consequences of the program. Even when small changes are made to a current policy, a new signature should be mentioned. Next slide. Well, we cover a lot of material today. To conclude the presentation, developing and managing a drug and alcohol program can be challenging. As the drug abuse in America evolves in times of crisis, your organization program needs to be able to evolve and adapt with it. At this point, you do see my contact information. If you have any questions for me whatsoever, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Otherwise, we can go ahead and start the Q&A part of this process.
Brady, extremely impactful information for our attendees. Thank you again so much for spending a couple minutes of your day helping share your wisdom and insight. We do have a couple of questions. Before we dive into that, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you answer your question and we don't have time, I know it is a great information, but we don't have a ton of time for questions. So if we aren't able to get to your specific question, we will reach out to you after Day with DISA. So don't hesitate to still put a question down in the Q&A box. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, it's now in the materials section at the bottom right. And without further ado, let's dive into questions. Brady, the first question that we have is, can you speak more on the subject about CBD oil and the legality of the substance here in the U.S.?
That's a tricky question to answer. On the federal level, CBD oil is legal. In the US, people generally divide CBD oil into two categories. You've got cannabis-derived CBD and hemp-derived CBD. The main difference between the two is that cannabis oil contains high amounts of THC, generally making it illegal in states where cannabis is not permitted for free use. Hemp-derived CBD oil, however, contains only up to 0.3% THC, making it legal nationwide unless enforced by a particular state law. Finally, almost all of the states within the United States find hemp-derived CBD oil legal, minus a few states like Nebraska and Idaho right now. If the product is classified as a cannabis-derived CBD oil, the number of states that find the product illegal increases drastically.
Okay, thank you, Brady. In your presentation, you talk about multiple drug testing methodologies in drug and alcohol programs. Can my company require my employees to participate in multiple types of drug programs?
The answer to your question is yes. Companies can require that their applicants or employees take part in multiple drug and alcohol programs. The beauty of a non-DOT corporate policy is that organizations have the ability to customize their drug and alcohol programs based off of the needs of their organization. Remember, the Department of Transportation doesn't legislate over your employees that don't fall within federally governed job functions. So you decide on what is tested and why.
Okay. Brady, hot topic, medical marijuana, obviously. Question on that is, does DISA foresee medical and or legalization of marijuana being an issue with future drug testing panels?
I'd say the legalization of marijuana for medicinal and recreational use can pose a challenge for the future drug policies. Historically, corporate drug policies assume, that any THC detected in from the ingestion of marijuana. CBD introduces a new consideration. Now companies will have situations to where a positive result for THC can either result from the ingestion of marijuana or CBD oil. What organizations will see in the future is drug programs that historically focused on the basic detection of THC in the specimen could start to shift focus on a type of detection that provides information about if the donor is currently under the influence of marijuana. For example, marijuana testing could look a lot like alcohol testing in the future. In fact, one of our Day with DISA sponsors, Hound Labs, has a EBD evidential breath testing device that determines if a donor is currently under the influence of THC. Their product is a device that you can basically blow into, and it's like an alcohol test, and it's going to tell you if they're under the influence.
Okay. So Brady, we use a consortium policy as our main policy for all employees. Is that okay to be doing?
As a third-party administrator, DISA suggests that sometimes it makes sense for organizations to have multiple types of drug and alcohol requirements for their employees based on the needs of those employees. Since DISA's National Contractor Consortium provides an employee's specific compliance status to a large number of oil and gas owner-operators on a national level, I'd refrain from testing all employees or office workers that are never going to be working on owner sites into the program. I'd recommend customizing a separate non-DOT corporate policy for non-consortium employees.
Brady, should I be testing all of my employees upon their return to the office after a COVID work from home stay?
Okay. The answer to this question depends on your company's drug and alcohol program and how it has performed during this national crisis, the COVID pandemic. In many cases, DISA clients have temporarily halted their drug and alcohol programs, including their random processes. If you're one of these companies, I'd say testing your employees as they come back to work isn't a bad idea. At minimum, make sure that your random drug program is re-implemented or activated. It is a fact in times of crisis, people are prone to use drugs and alcohol as a crutch in times of emotional distress. We saw statistical data earlier in the presentation that supported my statement.
Brady, what's a medical disclosure policy? You mentioned that towards the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As a safety prevention and control measure, many employers are including provisions for medication disclosures in their drug-free workplace program policies. Within the requirement, employees are supposed to self-identify to their employees about certain prescription drug use that can make certain job functions a challenge on the work site. So I use a medical disclosure. The most important thing is to address the issue of medication use, misuse, abuse before there is a problem in the workplace. Employee education and a written policy clearly defining employees' responsibilities and the employer's expectations are essential.
Brady, can I use instant drug testing in my policy?
In a corporate non-DOT policy, an organization has the ability to customize and create their own program. So the answer to your question is yes. As a reminder, a quick test isn't sufficient for Department of Transportation and or DISA contractor consortium testing. The DOT and the DCC require lab-based testing.
Brady, we have time for just one more question here. Who is required to complete reasonable suspicion training?
Reasonable suspicion training is applicable regulation requiring supervisors of employees that fall under certain DOT job functions to take 60 minutes of training on the symptoms of alcohol abuse and another 60 minutes of training on the symptoms of controlled substance abuse. So that's a total of 120 minutes. The purpose of the training is to teach supervisors to identify circumstances and indicators that may create reasonable suspicion that a driver is using or under the influence of alcohol or drugs, supporting referral or an employee for testing. So DOT supervisors are required to complete the training, but DISA recommends that all supervisors, especially in safety sensitive industries, complete reasonable suspicion trainings. It's a best practice that helps you mitigate risk, and I would recommend it on a yearly basis.
Awesome. Brady Quarles, Associate Vice President for DISA Global Solutions. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. And thank you so much to everyone for attending. We hope to see you in our next session.